Mary Poppins Comes Back by P. L. Travers, Chapter 6, Robertson A's Story. "Step along, please," said Mary Poppins, pushing the perambulator, with the twins at one end of it and Annabel at the other, toward her favorite seat in the park. It was a green one, quite near the lake, and she chose it because she could bend sideways every now and again and see her own reflection in the water. The sight of her face, gleaming between two water lilies, always gave her a pleasant feeling of satisfaction and contentment. Michael trudged behind. "We're always stepping along," he grumbled to Jane in a whisper, taking care that Mary Poppins did not hear him. "But we never seem to get anywhere." Mary Poppins turned round and glared at him. "Put your hat on straight." Michael tilted his hat over his eyes. It had HMS Trumpeter printed on the band, and he thought it suited him very well. But Mary Poppins was looking with contempt at them both. "Humph," she said. "You two look a picture, I must say. Stravagging away like a couple of tortoises, and no polish on your shoes." Well, it's Robertson A's half-day," said Jane. "I suppose he didn't have time to do them before he went out. Tch, lazy, good-for-nothing, that's what he is. Always was and always will be," Mary Poppins said, and savagely pushing the perambulator up against her own green seat. She lifted the twins and tucked the shawl tightly around Annabel. She glanced at her sunlit reflection in the lake and smiled in a superior way, straightening the new bow of ribbon at her neck. Then she took her bag of knitting from the perambulator. "How do you know he's always been idle?" asked Jane. "Did you know Robertson A before you came here?" "Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies," said Mary Poppins priggishly as she began to cast stitches for a woolen vest for John. "She never tells us anything," Michael grumbled. "I know," sighed Jane. But very soon they forgot about Robertson A and began to play Mr. and Mrs. Banks and their two children, and they became Red Indians. Then they became Red Indians, with John and Barbara for squaws. Sorry for the racist language there, folks. And after that they changed into tightrope walkers, with the back of the green seat for a rope. "Mind my hat, if you please," said Mary Poppins. It was a brown one with a pigeon's feather stuck into the ribbon. Michael went carefully, foot over foot, along the back of the seat. When he got to the end, he took off his hat and waved it. "Jane," he cried, "I'm the king of the castle, and you're the—" "Stop, Michael," she interrupted and pointed across the lake. "Look over there." Along the path, at the edge of the lake, came a tall, slim figure, curiously dressed. He wore stockings of red, striped with yellow. A red and yellow tunic scalloped at the edges, and on his head was a large-brimmed red and yellow hat with a high peaked crown. Jane and Michael watched with interest as he came toward them, moving with a lazy, swaggering step, his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled down over his eyes. He was whistling loudly as he drew nearer. They saw the peaks of his tunic and the brim of his hat were edged with little bells that jingled musically as he moved. He was the strangest person they had ever seen, and yet there was something about him that seemed familiar. "I think I've seen him before," said Jane, frowning and trying to remember. "So have I, but I can't think where." Michael balanced on the back of the seat and stared. Whistling and jingling, the curious figure slouched up to Mary Poppins and leaned against the perambulator. "Day, Mary," he said, putting a finger lazily in the brim of his hat. "And how are you keeping?" Mary Poppins looked up from her knitting. "None the better for your asking," she said with a loud sniff. Jane and Michael could not see the man's face or the brim of his hat, for the brim of his hat was well pulled down. But from the way the bells jingled, they knew he was laughing. "Busy as usual, I see," he remarked, glancing at the knitting. "But then, you always were, even at court. If you weren't dusting the throne, you'd be making the king's bed, and if you weren't doing that, you'd be polishing the crown jewels. I never knew such a one for work." "Well, it's more than anyone could say for you," said Mary Poppins crossly. "Ah," laughed the stranger, "that's just where you're wrong. I'm always busy. Doing nothing takes a great deal of time. All the time, in fact." Mary Poppins pursed her lips and made no reply. The stranger gave an amused chuckle. "Well, I must be getting along," he said. "See you again some day." He brushed a finger along the bells of his hat and sauntered lazily away, whistling as he went. Jane and Michael watched until he was out of sight. "The dirty rascal!" Mary Poppins' voice rapped out behind them, and they turned to find that she too was staring after the stranger. "Who was that man, Mary Poppins?" asked Michael, bouncing excitedly up and down the seat. "I've just told you," she snapped. "You said you were the king of the castle, and you're not by any means, but that's the dirty rascal." "You mean the one in the nursery rhyme?" demanded Jane breathlessly. "But nursery rhymes aren't true, are they?" protested Michael. "And if they are, who is the king of the castle?" "Hush!" said Jane, laying her hand on his arm. Mary Poppins had put down her knitting and was gazing out across the lake with a faraway look in her eyes. Jane and Michael sat very still, hoping if they made no sound she would tell them the whole story. The twins huddled together at one end of the perambulator, solemnly staring at Mary Poppins. Annabel at the other end was sound asleep. "The king of the castle," began Mary Poppins, folding her hands over her ball of wool, and gazing right through the children as though they were not there. "The king of the castle lived in a country so far away that most people have never heard of it. Think as far as you can, and it's even further than that. Think as high as you can, and it's higher than that. Think as deep as you can, and it's even deeper. And," she said, "if I were to tell you how rich he was, we'd be sitting here till next year and still be only halfway through the list of his treasures. He was enormously, preposterously, extravagantly rich. In fact, there was only one thing in the whole world that he did not possess, and that thing was wisdom." And so Mary Poppins went on. "His land was full of gold mines, and his people were polite and prosperous, and generally splendiferous. He had a good wife and 4 fat children, or perhaps it was 5. He never could remember the exact number because his memory was so bad. His castle was made of silver and granite, and his coffers were full of gold, and the diamonds in his crown were as big as ducks' eggs. He had many marvelous cities and sailing ships at sea, and for his right-hand man he had a Lord High Chancellor who knew exactly what was what and what was not, and advised the king accordingly. But the king had no wisdom. He was utterly and absolutely foolish, and what was more, he knew it. Indeed, he could hardly help knowing it, for everybody from the Queen and the Lord High Chancellor downwards was constantly reminding him of the fact. Even bus conductors and engine drivers and the people who served in shops could hardly refrain from letting the king know that they knew he had no wisdom. They didn't dislike him, they merely felt a contempt for him. It was not the king's fault that he was so stupid. He had tried to learn wisdom ever since he was a boy, but in the middle of his lessons, even when he was a grown-up, he would suddenly burst into tears and, wiping his eyes on his ermine train, would cry, "I know I shall never be any good at it, never, so why nag me?" But still his teachers continued to make the effort. Professors came from all over the world to try to teach the king of the castle something, even if it was only twice times 2 or CAT cat, but none of them had the slightest effect on him. Then the queen had an idea. "Let us," she said to the Lord High Chancellor, "offer a reward to the professor who can teach the king a little wisdom, and if at the end of the month he has not succeeded, his head shall be cut off and spiked on the castle gates as a warning to other professors of what will happen if they fail." And as most of them were rather poor, and the reward was a large money prize, the professors kept on coming and failing and losing hope, and also their heads and the spikes of the castle gate became rather crowded. Things went from bad to worse, and at last the queen said to the king, "Ethelbert," that was the king's private name, "I really think you had better leave the government of the kingdom to me and the Lord High Chancellor, as we both know a good deal about everything." "But that wouldn't be fair," said the king, protesting. "After all, it's my kingdom." However, he gave in at last, because he knew she was cleverer than he. But he so much resented being ordered about in his own castle, and having to use the bent scepter because he always chewed the knob of the best one, that he went on receiving the professors and trying to learn wisdom and weeping when he found he couldn't. He wept for their sakes as well as his own, for it made him unhappy to see their heads on the gate. Each new professor arrived full of hope and assurance, and began with some question that the last had not asked. "What'll 6 and 7, your Majesty?" inquired a young and handsome professor who had come from a great distance. And the king, trying his hardest, thought for a moment, then he leaned forward eagerly and answered, "Why, 12, of course." said the Lord High Chancellor, standing beside the king, beside the king's chair. The professor groaned. 6 and 7 are 13, Your Majesty. Oh, I'm so sorry. Try another question, please. I am sure I shall get the next one right. Well then, what are 5 and 8? Oh, let me see, don't tell me. It's just at the tip of my tongue. Yes, 5 and 8 are 11, said the Lord High Chancellor. 13, cried the young professor, hopelessly. Oh, my dear fellow, you just said that 6 and 7 were 13. So how can 5 and 8 be? There aren't 2 13s, surely. But the young professor only shook his head and loosened his collar, and went dejectedly away with the executioner. Is there more than 1 13, then? Asked the king nervously. The Lord High Chancellor turned away in disgust. I'm sorry, said the king to himself. I liked his face so much, it's a pity it has to go on the gate. And after that he worked very hard at his arithmetic, hoping that when the next professor came, he would be able to give the right answer. He would sit at the top of the castle steps, just by the drawbridge, with a book of multiplication tables on his knee, saying them over to himself, and while he was looking at the book, everything went well. But when he shut his eyes and tried to remember them, everything went wrong. 7 ones are 7, 7 twos are 33, 7 threes are 45, he began one day, and when he found he was wrong, he threw the book away in disgust and buried his head in his cloak. It's no good, I shall never be wise, he cried in despair. Then, because he could not go on weeping forever, he wiped his eyes and leant back in his golden chair, and as he did that, he gave a little start of surprise, for a stranger had pushed past the sentry at the gate, and was walking up the path that led to the castle. Hello,